Welcome to the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency's applicant briefing for the declared disaster designated as DR-4612 under FEMA's Public Assistance Program. The information in this briefing is accurate as of September 1st of 2021. This page contains the contact information for FEMA's Public Assistance Work Group. Each county is color-coded to a specific team found on the map. Please contact the team members that match your county. State agencies are assigned to the green team. Rural electric co-ops are assigned to the red team. This is FEMA's Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, version 4, which is applicable to all disasters declared after June 1st of 2020. This document can be found in FEMA's Media Library on their website through the link provided. This is the public assistance process. It begins with a disaster event. The incident period for DR-4612 is June 24th through July 1st of 2021. FEMA completed the preliminary damage assessment and submitted our request for a declaration through the Governor's Office to the President. We received the declaration for DR-4612 on September 1st of 2021. This is the virtual applicant briefing for DR-4612. The next step in the process following the applicant briefing is for each jurisdiction to submit their Federal Request for Public Assistance, or RPA. This submission has a deadline of 30 days after the declaration date, which was September 1st, 2021. RPAs will be due on or before October 1st, 2021. In addition to the federal RPA, the state of Missouri has supplied forms which will be required for communication and the processing of payments. FEMA recommends submission of the completed forms within 60 days of the declaration date. These forms can be downloaded from the FEMA website or requested from your designated FEMA contacts. Submitting your federal request for public assistance can be accomplished in one of two ways: through Grants Portal or through the submission of a paper copy of the RPA. Before submitting an RPA through Grants Portal, you'll need to set up an account if you have not already done so. Grants Portal has been in use since 2017, and many jurisdictions have already participated in a declared disaster event that utilizes Grants Portal. For those applicants that have not participated in a disaster event since 2017, your information may have been added to Grants Portal by FEMA. FEMA staff can assist you with updating your contact information in Grants Portal. If you choose to submit a paper copy of the federal RPA, you can download the form on the FEMA website, complete it, and forward to the email address provided. Once FEMA has entered your information, you will receive an email requesting that you access Grants Portal. Here's a screen capture of the Grants Portal website login. Grants Portal is a browser-based tool that you can use to find and download necessary forms, upload documentation for viewing by FEMA and FEMA staff, and for tracking the progress of your project formulation by FEMA. Once the RPA has been submitted, a FEMA representative referred to as a Program Delivery Manager will contact each applicant to introduce themselves and to set a date for the recovery scoping meeting. This first phone call is referred to as the exploratory call and provides FEMA the opportunity to gather some initial information from the applicant. The recovery scoping meeting will be the first substantial meeting between FEMA and the applicant, which will allow an in-depth look at the applicant's damages and begin the process of gathering documentation related to costs and eligibility. FEMA will work with the applicant to develop a list of projects and begin scheduling future site inspections. The recovery scoping meeting is important because it starts the clock for the identification and submission of damages to FEMA by the applicant. The applicant has 60 days from the RSM to report all identified damages to FEMA. What is public assistance? The Public Assistance Program is a supplemental cost share program that reimburses eligible applicants in a presidentially declared disaster. The federal share is equal to 75% of eligible costs. The non-federal share, which is the remaining 25% of the eligible costs, is the responsibility of the applicant. Eligibility for the Public Assistance Program encompasses four components referred to as the eligibility pyramid. At the foundation is applicant eligibility, followed by facility eligibility, then eligible work, and finally eligible cost. Determinations of eligibility are made in this order. As FEMA evaluates eligibility, applicants may receive a request for information. Applicants are required to provide supporting documentation that proves their eligibility. If the applicant or any part of the project are found to be ineligible, FEMA will issue a determination of eligibility or determination memo. This letter will provide both an explanation of the ineligible elements and the law or statute under which it is determined. An applicant may receive a partial determination of eligibility, meaning that some costs are eligible but some are not. If an applicant disagrees with FEMA's determination, they will be provided the opportunity to appeal the decision by providing additional documentation or information that disputes the determination. The applicant has the right to appeal the determination within 60 days of notification. The appeal must be in writing and submitted to SEMA. SEMA will review the submission, provide a recommendation based on the Public Assistance Program and policy, and forward the request to FEMA for a decision. Eligible applicants are typically entities that provide services to the general public. They could be state-based applicants, such as state parks, public universities, or state agencies and departments. They could be county applicants, including road and levee districts. They could be local applicants, such as a public school, hospital, library, or museum. They could even be private nonprofit organizations that provide essential or critical services to the general public, perhaps a nursing facility or electric co-ops. Native American tribes and tribal organizations can also be eligible, but there are currently no tribal groups recognized in the state of Missouri at this time. Some private nonprofit entities may be eligible for this funding. Entities that provide critical services or non-critical but essential services can be eligible. Some general categories of critical services are listed on the slide, but specific examples can include irrigation to provide drinking water, sewer and wastewater treatment, and electrical utilities. Some examples of non-critical but essential services are also listed. If you are the owner of a nonprofit organization that provides critical or non-critical but essential services to the general public, you may be eligible for reimbursement of costs directly related to a particular disaster. The owner or operator of a private nonprofit entity must submit a completed private nonprofit facility questionnaire, a current tax exemption status letter, or letter from the state substantiating non-revenue producing nonprofit status, proof of ownership or legal responsibility, and a list of services provided. The U.S. Small Business Administration is able to provide funding in the aftermath of a major disaster declaration. FEMA provides disaster recovery funding through the Public Assistance Program only if no other federal program is responsible for funding the recovery. For eligible private nonprofits that provide non-critical services, FEMA will only provide PA funding if an SBA loan will not cover the full recovery of the eligible facility. Before a non-critical private nonprofit can apply for public assistance, the owner or operator must apply for a loan with the Small Business Association. If they are found ineligible or receive maximum funding through this source, but still have eligible costs that are not covered, they may then apply for funding through FEMA. We now move from applicant eligibility to general work eligibility. Damage must be a direct result of the declared event and must have occurred during the established incident period. The damaged facilities that are submitted for claim must be within one of the declared counties. This seems straightforward, but what happens when a fairly large organization or one of their facilities stretches across more than one county? One example would be Table Rock State Park, which lies in both Taney and Stone counties. If only one of these counties has been declared, then only damages within that segment of the park would be eligible for reimbursement within the program. Finally, repairs must be the legal responsibility of the eligible applicant at the time of the disaster event. The next several graphics will cover environmental and historic preservation requirements as they relate to general work eligibility. FEMA's EHP section reviews all written projects for compliance with applicable statutes, executive orders, and regulations that establish requirements to protect the environment and preserve the nation's historic and archaeological resources. The applicant is responsible for assuring compliance with all applicable EHP laws, even if FEMA is not providing PA funding for all of the work. In addition to identifying compliance requirements, FEMA will seek opportunities to incorporate conservation measures in the projects. Appendix A in the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide provides a list of frequently encountered EHP statutes, executive orders, and regulations. The next slide provides a partial list that is frequently applicable to the state of Missouri. From this slide, the most frequently observed EHP statutes within the state of Missouri include the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. Any structure over 50 years of age is automatically reviewed by FEMA and the State Historic Preservation Office to determine if the facility is listed on the Historic Register. Ground disturbing activities are reviewed for the possibility of impact to historic sites, such as burial grounds. Several endangered species exist within the state boundaries, and EHP must review projects to determine if their habitats will be impacted. If an endangered species is discovered during project work, all activities must cease until an environmental review can be completed or an applicant could face the loss of funding eligibility. If project work will occur near designated waters of the United States, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers must be consulted to determine permitting requirements. An applicant may be required to submit a compliance narrative to FEMA that describes their work on the facility to assure that they abided by the Clean Water Act regulations. If an applicant intends to reduce woody debris by burning, a Clean Air Act permit may be required. Applicants should consult their local and state regulations for compliance. This section of the briefing will discuss facility eligibility. An eligible facility is defined as a building, system, equipment, or an improved and maintained natural feature. Some examples are shown here. As a reminder, the facility must be the legal responsibility of the applicant at the time of the disaster event. Some facilities may be ineligible if they are inactive or partially inactive when the disaster incident occurred. If the facility is only temporarily inactive, is currently under construction, or is designated for use in the near future, then that facility may be considered eligible for recovery through public assistance. If a facility was already damaged, it may be eligible for repairs through recovery funding, but only for damage that resulted from the declared disaster event. If a facility is scheduled for replacement with federal funds through another agency, the facility is not eligible for public assistance funding. As previously stated, applicants are required to report damages within 60 days of the recovery scoping meeting. FEMA may extend the reporting deadline with sufficient justification at the request of the applicant. The extension request must be submitted to SEMA for review and submittal to FEMA. Damages are reported using a damage inventory form that is available for download within the grants portal. The damage inventory form requests information related to the damage of an eligible facility, such as the street address or GPS location of damages, as well as a description and their dimensions. Facilities that may have multiple damaged sites, such as gravel roads or utility systems, will be reported separately as individual sites. Eligible damage sites that fall under the same damage category or as part of similar facilities may be grouped together during project formulation. If a site or facility is under the authority of another federal agency, these will be excluded as a matter of ineligibility through an issued determination memo or by agreement of the applicant to voluntarily withdraw those damages from the damage inventory reporting form. FEMA will schedule visits to reported damage sites with the applicant in attendance. The purpose of these site inspections will be to gather additional relevant information about the reported damages. FEMA may request documentation to determine the eligibility of damages related to the declared disaster event, including records of regular maintenance. FEMA and the applicant must reach agreement on the disaster-related damages before the project scope of work can be written. The scope of work describes the recovery methods that will be utilized to return the facility to pre-disaster condition. If an agreement cannot be reached, FEMA will issue a determination memo regarding damage eligibility. If the applicant provides adequate information through documentation, including location, dimensions, invoicing for costs, and/or photographs of the pre- and post-disaster condition, a site inspection may not be necessary. You may have heard the saying, plan the work and then work the plan. A project worksheet is the written plan that identifies the elements of a damaged facility and then the method that will be used to return that facility to pre-disaster condition. Once this project worksheet is developed and approved by FEMA, be sure to complete the work as described in the scope of work. Any changes to the methods described in the scope of work must be approved by FEMA to maintain eligibility. Contact SEMA to begin the request to change the scope of work. Cost eligibility is the final component of the eligibility pyramid. However, even if all other eligibility criteria have been met, an incurred cost is not always eligible. The costs must be tied directly to the eligible work, and they must be adequately documented. Costs must be reduced as necessary by applicable credits, such as salvage or insurance proceeds. Applicants will maintain eligibility of costs by following all applicable legal regulations, as well as their uniformly applied internal cost practices, such as contract bidding. Finally, the work must be necessary and reasonable to complete the work and return the facility to pre-disaster condition. All determinations on the reasonableness of cost will be made by FEMA. A cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the applicant makes the decision to incur the cost. It is extremely important that an applicant understand how FEMA evaluates the reasonableness of a cost and pays particular attention to ensuring they follow ethical business practices. For example, the procurement of contracting to perform work must not include parties with a financial interest in the applicant's operations, such as a familial relation of a board member. Comprehensive record keeping is critical to proving cost eligibility. Develop a plan for keeping track of such things as hours worked and by whom, pay and benefit rates, contracts, invoices, and proof of payments. It is also recommended that an applicant keeps track of donated labor, equipment, and materials as they may be reimbursable towards the non-federal share of eligible work projects. FEMA refers to an applicant's personnel as force account. FEMA reimburses force account labor based on actual hourly rates plus the cost of the employee's actual fringe benefits. FEMA will typically request a completed fringe benefit worksheet from applicants to include any or all of the fringe benefits as eligible costs in addition to labor wages. Applicants are encouraged to have a written personnel policy that defines the nature of overtime pay versus compensatory time, but that policy must be uniformly applied at all times and cannot contain a contingency clause related to federal funding. As a reminder, emergency protective measure projects will only reimburse an applicant for overtime hours, as normal work hours would be considered a standard expense based on the requirements of the job performed. For example, a law enforcement officer working their normal schedule during a disaster incident period would not be reimbursed to the applicant as an eligible cost, but if that officer is required to work overtime during the disaster event, those overtime hours can be claimed as an eligible cost as defined by the applicant's personnel policy. Reassigned employees are those that temporarily do different work from their normal job descriptions. This other work is the work that is essential to the success of the eligible project and can be eligible for reimbursement at that employee's regular wage rate. Temporary employees are workers hired specifically to perform eligible work. That eligible work may be related to emergency work, such as debris cleanup, or permanent work, such as a road grader operator. A temporary employee could also be hired to perform project management-related work, such as managing project documentation and performing billing actions. The revised statutes of Missouri, sections 285.525 through 285.555, illegal immigrants ensures that no business entity or employer shall knowingly employ, hire for employment, or continue to employ an unauthorized alien to perform work within the state of Missouri. In addition to labor cost eligibility, FEMA provides PA funding for the operation of equipment owned by the applicant. This cost is typically calculated with an established rate, primarily with an hourly rate, but some equipment is rated based on mileage. These costs are calculated based on the number of hours that the applicant utilized the equipment as compared to their labor hours. As a reminder, the applicant must adequately document these costs by the appropriate rate in order to be reimbursed for eligible costs and work. FEMA has published a schedule of equipment rates that is applicable on a national basis. This schedule is current as of August 27, 2019, is applicable to this disaster, and can be found at the link provided. In some cases, FEMA may allow the use of local rates, but will compare these to the FEMA rate and will reimburse the applicant based on the lower rate unless that rate does not reflect all applicable costs to operating the equipment. If a piece of equipment is not listed on the schedule of equipment rates, a rate can be proposed by the applicant based on adequate documentation for current market pricing. For the cost eligibility of leased equipment, FEMA will reimburse based on the terms of the leasing contract. The applicant should be sure to follow the procurement policy and seek a reasonable price for the terms of the agreement. FEMA will compare the cost of purchasing and maintaining a piece of equipment versus the cost of leasing when determining the cost eligibility for reimbursement. As with other eligibility costs, the actual cost for materials will be used for the project worksheet's cost estimate whenever possible. If the materials were taken from the applicant's stock, the reimbursement will be based on the applicant's purchasing invoices or local vendor estimates. Adequate and accurate documentation will help the applicant maintain the best eligibility of costs. The next 13 slides cover the various statutory requirements for procurement and contracting. I will often read the text verbatim because procurement is an important issue with serious eligibility considerations. Applicants must comply with federal procurement requirements as a condition of receiving public assistance funding for contract costs for eligible work. FEMA may deny a portion of costs or all costs if procurement requirements are not met. Applicants are expected to have their own written procurement policies. FEMA will review all policies that were in effect as of the first day of the disaster's incident period. The applicant must abide by the most restrictive procurement requirement between their own requirements or those of the state or federal government. Applicants should review procurement requirements prior to pursuing procurement of a contract for eligible work. For example, 2 CFR 200.318a states that a tribal or local government or PNP must establish or update written procurement procedures that reflect applicable state, local, tribal, or territorial laws and regulations. Conflicts of interest have been an issue with procurement in recent disaster events. If the perception of impropriety may exist, an applicant may wish to avoid executing a contract that may risk the eligibility of the cost. Please contact SEMA with questions regarding procurement considerations. As discussed previously, reasonableness of cost will also apply to contracts related to eligible work. Price competition is typically established by obtaining multiple bids for contract work. If price competition is lacking, FEMA will examine contract cost for reasonableness and eligibility. An applicant may select a bidder other than the lowest bidder, but an explanation must be submitted to SEMA for review and approval prior to awarding the contract. If the selection is not the lowest bidder and has not been approved, the applicant will risk cost reimbursement eligibility for the project. FEMA will make the final determination on all eligibility of costs. General federal procurement requirements include the following: an expectation that the applicant will provide full and open competition, that they will solicit bids and encourage the participation of small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms when possible, that they will perform a cost or price analysis in connection with every procurement action above the simplified acquisition threshold, including contract modifications. Applicants will be expected to evaluate and document the contractor's integrity, compliance with public policy, and record of past performance and financial and technical resources. They must ensure that the contractor was not suspended or debarred. The applicant must maintain records to detail the history of the procurement process, including, but not limited to, the rationale for the method of procurement, the selection of the contract type, the contractor's selection or rejection, and the basis for the contract price. Tribal and local governments and private nonprofits must use one of the following procurement methods: micro-purchase, small purchase procedure, sealed bid, competitive proposal, or non-competitive proposal, also called sole sourcing. For non-competitive procurement, FEMA may reimburse costs incurred under a contract procured through a non-competitive proposal, also referred to as sole sourcing, but only when one or more of the following circumstances applies. The item is only available from one source. The public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit a delay resulting from competitive solicitation. FEMA or the state expressly authorizes a non-competitive proposal in response to a written request from the applicant, or after solicitation of several sources, competition is determined to be inadequate. The applicant must identify the circumstances and provide documentation of the justification. FEMA has issued recent determinations of ineligibility regarding justification of exigent or emergency circumstances for contracting. Those determinations have stated that if an applicant has time to reasonably bid the contract, then the awarding of the contract cannot be issued under exigent or emergency circumstances. Based on SEMA's recent experience with this issue, an exigent or emergency circumstance primarily occurs within the immediate aftermath of the event when there is a critical need to repair damages quickly. The applicant is advised to pursue proper procurement if the work will continue for an extended time. FEMA reimburses costs incurred by tribal and local governments and private nonprofits using three types of contract payment obligations: fixed priced, cost reimbursement, and, to a limited extent, time and materials contracts. Local governments and private nonprofits must maintain oversight on all contracts to ensure contractors perform according to the conditions and specifications of the contract and any purchase orders. Project oversight is another recent procurement issue that has resulted in determinations of ineligibility. It is recommended that applicants have someone on site when contractors are performing eligible work and appropriate tracking of cost is occurring. This will help meet the reasonableness requirement for eligible costs. Time and material contracts do not provide incentives to the contractor for cost control or labor efficiency. Therefore, use of time and material contracts are only allowed if all of the following apply. No other contract type was suitable, the contract has a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at its own risk, and the applicant maintains a high degree of oversight to obtain reasonable assurance that the contractor is using efficient methods and effective cost controls. In addition to limiting reimbursement to costs that can be determined to be reasonable, FEMA does not reimburse the increased costs associated with the percentage of a cost plus percentage of cost calculation or percentage of construction cost method. This type of contract billing is prohibited as it does not provide incentive to contractors to control costs because the contractor's profit increases as the cost of performance increases. Time and material contracts do not provide incentives to the contractor for cost control or labor efficiency. Therefore, use of time and material contracts are only allowed if all of the following apply. No other contract type was suitable, the contract has a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at its own risk, and the applicant maintains a high degree of oversight to obtain reasonable assurance that the contractor is using efficient methods and effective cost controls. In addition to limiting reimbursement to costs that can be determined to be reasonable, FEMA does not reimburse the increased costs associated with the percentage of a cost plus percentage of cost calculation or percentage of construction cost method. This type of contract billing is prohibited as it does not provide incentive to contractors to control costs because the contractor's profit increases as the cost of performance increases. The applicant should submit the following to support contract costs claimed. This is not an all-inclusive list. Their procurement policy, procurement documentation, a cost or price analysis, contracts, change orders, and summary of invoices, dates worked, and documentation that substantiates a high degree of contractor oversight, such as daily or weekly logs and records of performance meetings. FEMA allows applicants to use the value of donated resources to offset the non-federal cost share of its eligible emergency work project worksheets and direct federal assistance. What is a donated resource? It is a non-cash contribution, property, or service related to eligible work. Members of the community, whether individual citizens or another group, may donate labor, equipment, or materials towards the completion of eligible work. The applicant should record the labor and equipment time and material values in a manner similar to the documentation of other eligible work. These costs can be used to offset the costs of non-federal share of applicable projects. The offset may be applied if all of the following conditions are met. The donated resources from a third party, either a private entity or individual not employed by the applicant, federal, state, territorial, or tribal government. The resource is necessary and reasonable for the accomplishment of the project. The applicant uses the resource in the performance of eligible work and within the respective project's period of performance. And applicant or volunteer organization tracks the resources, work performed, and includes the description, specific locations, and hours. For example, if an applicant community has 250 individuals perform labor to help fill and place sandbags to prevent flooding, and these individuals perform 2,500 hours of donated labor, the value of those labor hours can be applied to the non-federal share of an eligible emergency work project for flood prevention by that applicant. A donated resources rate will be determined based on a national wage average and will be used to calculate the value of donated labor. Donated equipment would be valued based on the FEMA equipment rates and an accounting of hours used. Donated materials would be valued based on current market rates. These costs must be adequately and accurately documented to be eligible. Duplication of benefits is not allowed. FEMA cannot provide funding that duplicates insurance proceeds. FEMA cannot duplicate funds provided by another federal agency. And any grants or cash donations from other sources, such as community development block grants, may only be used towards the non-federal cost share or public assistance in eligible work. Actual or anticipated insurance proceeds must be deducted from the eligible project cost for facilities that are insured or should have been insured at the time of the disaster event, and or obtain and maintain conditions of previous PA grants. All applicants are required to obtain and maintain insurance coverage on all insurable facilities as a condition of public assistance funding. This next segment of the briefing will cover the categories of work under the Public Assistance Program. Categories of work are broken into two groups, emergency work and permanent work. Emergency work projects are required actions taken to save lives, protect public health and safety, protect improved property, or eliminate or lessen an immediate threat of additional damage. Immediate threat is the threat of additional damage or destruction from an incident that can reasonably be expected to occur within 5 years of the declared incident. The deadline to complete emergency work projects is 6 months from the declaration date, unless the state or FEMA authorizes an extension. The first category of work is Category A, or debris removal. Debris removal activities, such as clearance, removal, and disposal, are eligible as Category A if the removal is in the public interest based on whether the work eliminates immediate threats to lives, public health, and safety, eliminates the immediate threats of significant damage to improved public or private property, ensures the economic recovery of the affected community to the benefit of the community at large, and/or mitigates risk to life and property by removing substantially damaged structures and associated structures and appurtenances as needed to convert property acquired using Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds to uses compatible with open space, recreation, or wetlands management practices. Debris removal from private property is the responsibility of the property owner and is usually ineligible under PA program. In limited circumstances, based on the severity of the impact of an incident and whether debris on private property is so widespread that it threatens public health and safety or the economic recovery of the community, FEMA may determine that debris removal from private property is eligible under the PA program. In such cases, FEMA works with the state, local, territorial, or tribal governments to designate specific areas where debris removal from private property, including private waterways, is eligible. The debris removal must be in the public interest, not merely benefiting an individual or limited group of individuals. Alternative procedures for debris removal. The applicant may elect to participate in the alternative procedures for debris removal and receive reimbursement for straight time for the applicant's budget employees that conduct debris removal activities. The applicant opts in by including straight time in their debris removal project claims. The second category of work is Category B, or Emergency Protective Measures. Emergency protective measures are conducted before, during, and after an incident and are eligible if the measures eliminate or lessen immediate threats to lives, public health, or safety, or eliminate or lessen immediate threats of significant additional damage to improved public or private property in a cost-effective manner. FEMA may require certification by federal or state, local, tribal, or territorial government officials that a threat exists, including identification and evaluation of the threat, and recommendations of the work necessary to cope with the threat. Eligible emergency protective measures may include, but are not limited to, the following: saving lives and protecting public health and safety, flood fighting, emergency operations centers, evacuation and sheltering, and emergency repair or stabilization. Some emergency protective measures are temporary in nature. Costs related to placement and removal should be included in the scope of work. The remaining categories of work are identified as permanent work. Permanent work is work required to restore a facility to its pre-disaster design, which includes size and capacity, and function in accordance with applicable codes and standards. The deadline to complete permanent work is 18 months from the declaration date unless the recipient or FEMA authorize an extension. The 5 categories of eligible permanent work are Category C, road and bridge systems, Category D, water control facilities, Category E, public buildings and equipment, Category F, public utilities, and Category G, parks, recreational, and other facilities. As previously discussed, certain environmental and historic preservation considerations must be applied to permanent work projects. The applicant needs to make every effort to afford FEMA the opportunity to perform EHP reviews prior to starting any work that has the potential to impact the environment or historic properties, including archaeological services. FEMA must ensure that the project complies with appropriate EHP laws, regulations, and executive orders. Permanent work projects that restore a damaged facility essentially to pre-disaster design are excluded from National Environmental Policy Act review through a statutory exclusion. All others require NEPA review. Many qualify for one of the categorical exclusions under NEPA, which apply to actions that typically have little or no impact on the environment, as long as there are no extraordinary circumstances as defined by the Department of Homeland Security. If a project does not meet a Cat X, it will require a higher level of NEPA analysis. The most common higher level analysis is referred to as an environmental assessment. In rare circumstances, a project may require an environmental impact statement, the highest level of analysis, which requires a much more detailed analysis than an environmental assessment. FEMA is responsible for NEPA compliance and identifying required level of review. FEMA may be required to consult with federal, state, territorial, and tribal government resource agencies before the applicant begins work. As stated before, applicants that receive PA funding for permanent work to replace, repair, reconstruct, or construct a facility must obtain and maintain insurance to protect the facility against future loss. This requirement applies to insurable facilities or property, including those funded as an alternate, improved, or alternate procedures project. The applicant must insure facilities with the types and extent of insurance reasonably available, adequate, and necessary to protect against future loss to the property. The applicant is not required to obtain and maintain insurance on facilities with $5,000 or less in eligible costs prior to any reductions. If the applicant does not comply with the requirement to obtain and maintain insurance, FEMA will deny or deobligate PA funds related to noncompliance from the current disaster. The primary objective of public assistance is to repair a facility to pre-disaster condition. However, in some circumstances, FEMA may apply upgrades to facilities as required by codes and standards or through the use of hazard mitigation. FEMA provides PA funding to restore facilities based on pre-disaster design and function in conformity with current applicable codes and specifications and standards. The applicant needs to provide documentation to support the eligibility of code and standard upgrades, including, but not limited to, the requirement to apply the codes or standards and to support that they were formally adopted, implemented, and uniformly applied. Codes and standards must be reasonable. Facility repairs and new constructions may trigger upgrade requirements established by codes and standards. Upgrades required by federal or state, local, territorial, or tribal repair or replacement codes or standards are eligible only if the code or standard applies to the type of restoration required, is appropriate to the pre-disaster use of the facility, is reasonable, in writing, formally adopted by the state, local, territorial, or tribal government, and is implemented by the applicant on or before the declaration date, or is a legal federal requirement, applies uniformly, and was enforced during the time it was in effect. For buildings, electric power, roads, bridges, potable water supply, and wastewater, FEMA requires that applicants incorporate specific codes, specifications, and standards in accordance with FEMA Recovery Interim Policy FP 104-009-11, Consensus-Based Codes, Specifications, and Standards for Public Assistance, version 2.1. This is effective as of November 1st, 2020, and is retroactive to August 1st, 2017. The source is Section 1235B of the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act of 2018, otherwise referred to as DRRA of 2018. It can be located at the link provided. FEMA will update Appendix A of this interim policy periodically to incorporate additional consensus-based code specifications and standards. The applicant will be responsible for identifying and applying the applicable consensus-based codes and specifications and standards used in each PA project. The applicant will use consensus-based codes, specifications, and standards outlined in Appendix A as the minimum design criteria for eligible projects. Section 406 of the Stafford Act provides the opportunity for hazard mitigation within the public assistance program. Hazard mitigation is a sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural hazards and their effects. FEMA has authority to provide PA funding for cost-effective hazard mitigation measures for facilities damaged by the incident. FEMA evaluates proposed public assistance mitigation measures for eligibility, cost-effectiveness, technical feasibility and effectiveness, and compliance with EHP laws, regulations, and executive orders. In addition, FEMA ensures that the mitigation does not negatively impact the facility's operation or surrounding areas or create susceptibility to damage from another hazard. When evaluating whether a damaged facility is eligible for replacement, FEMA compares the repair cost with the replacement cost and evaluates the feasibility of repairing the facility. A facility is considered repairable when the cost to repair the disaster-related damage does not exceed 50% of the cost to replace the facility based on its pre-disaster size, capacity, and function, and it is feasible to repair the facility so that it can perform the pre-disaster function as well as it did prior to the incident. FEMA may approve funding for and require restoration of an applicant's destroyed facility at a new location. See pages 160 and 161 of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide version 4 for more information. FEMA offers 3 options that provide flexibility for the applicant to use public assistance funding for different purposes than restoring the pre-disaster design and function of the facility. For these options, FEMA caps the amount of the PA funding based on an estimated amount to restore the damaged facility to its pre-disaster design and function, including current eligible codes and standards. The 3 capped project options are alternative procedures projects under Section 428 for large projects only, improved projects, and alternate projects. Capped projects may involve significant changes to the pre-disaster configuration of a facility. FEMA conducts EHP compliance reviews on the actual proposed scope of work to be performed prior to approving the project. The first type of capped project is the alternative procedures for large projects. This type of project offers the maximum amount of flexibility with how the applicant may use PA funding, including the use of excess funds which are not eligible under the improved or alternate project options. The applicant may use funds across all permanent work alternative procedures projects with no requirement to rebuild communities back to what existed prior to the disaster. FEMA caps federal funding for an alternate procedures project based on the aggregate federal share of the approved estimated cost to restore the damaged facilities to pre-disaster design and function in accordance with eligible codes and standards, and for cost-effective PA mitigation measures associated with the actual restoration scope of work that the applicant will perform. FEMA will complete a fixed cost estimate for all large permanent work projects. FEMA will transmit this estimate as a fixed cost offer to the applicant for consideration. When the applicant accepts a fixed cost offer for a large project, FEMA considers it an alternative procedures project. The applicant may use alternative procedures permanent work project funds, including any excess funds across all of its alternative procedures permanent work projects. Any excess funds remaining after the approved scope of work is complete may be used for cost-effective activities that reduce the risk of future damage, hardship, or suffering from a major disaster, and activities that improve future public assistance operations or planning. The applicant must submit a proposed scope of work for the use of any excess funds, along with a project timeline to the recipient within 90 days of completing its last alternative procedures project. FEMA evaluates the proposed use of excess funds for reasonableness to ensure prudent use of funds, the submitted project timeline, and approves any appropriate deadline for the work completion. If the applicant does not accept the fixed cost offer, the project will be processed utilizing standard procedures and the final funding will be based on actual costs. The applicant may wish to make improvements to a damaged facility that are not required by eligible codes or standards. A project that restores the pre-disaster function of a facility and incorporates improvements or changes to the pre-disaster design is an improved project. The applicant may determine that the public welfare is not best served by restoring the function of the damaged facility. When this occurs, the applicant must obtain FEMA's approval to apply public assistance funding towards a different facility or facilities. The alternate project must be a permanent project that benefits the general public, serving the same general area that was being served by the original facility. FEMA limits federal funding for an improved or alternate project to the lesser of the following: the federal share of the approved estimate to restore the damaged facility to its pre-disaster design and function, or the federal share of the actual costs of completing the improved or alternate project. This next segment of the briefing covers management costs under the new interim policy. The following procedures apply to all applicants that receive management cost contributions under the interim policy, including DR-4612. Applicants may only request the initial Category Z project worksheet once projects have been obligated. The Category Z project worksheet will be based on the total award amount. The total award amount is the actual eligible PA project cost, including the non-federal share, after insurance and any other reductions. It does not include donated resources or management costs themselves. Applicants need to certify that management activities and associated costs claimed are eligible, consistent with the interim policy, and not related to ineligible projects. If and when an applicant requests a Category Z project worksheet, the Program Delivery Manager will formulate a Category Z project worksheet for 5% of the total award amount obligated for an applicant at the time of its request. FEMA may process amendments up to once a quarter for 5% of the total award amount obligated for the applicant at the time of its amendment request. If all final actual management costs are known at the time the applicant requests a Category Z project worksheet, the applicant should submit its claim for all eligible costs incurred, and FEMA will obligate the Category Z project worksheet based on the actual eligible costs up to the 5% maximum. All Category Z project worksheets will be reconciled and reimbursed based on actual cost. This includes Category Z project worksheets that are below the large project threshold. For example, an applicant has 5 project worksheets with a combined total award amount obligated at $300,000. The Category Z project worksheet would be obligated for a maximum of 5% of $300,000 or $15,000. If another project worksheet is obligated, 5% of those costs would be added to the Category Z project worksheet as an amendment request. In an effort to obligate management cost funds in a fiscally responsible manner, FEMA applies strategic funds management requirements to interim policy Category Z project worksheets. FEMA will use the strategic funds management process for Category Z project worksheets or versions where the applicant will not require funds for more than 1 year. In such cases, applicants must provide projected dates for when and how management cost funding is needed and a plan for expending management cost funds. Applicants must provide documentation to substantiate cost claim for eligible management activity. Additionally, cost claim must be reasonable. An applicant must provide an explanation of work performed with a representative sample of daily logs and activity reports. The activity must be related to eligible projects. Therefore, management costs associated with an appeal that is ultimately denied are not eligible. The applicant may claim management costs incurred up to whichever of the following occurs first: 180 days after the applicant completes its last non-management cost PA project, or 180 days after the latest performance period of the applicant's non-management cost PA project, or 2 years from the date of the emergency declaration, or 8 years from the date of the major disaster declaration. The next segment of the applicant briefing discusses topics related to project worksheet development. For completed work, the applicant must describe the completed scope of work for each of the projects and provide supporting documentation. For emergency work, the scope of work includes work related to address immediate threats and to remove debris and must include quantitative information. For permanent work, the scope of work includes a description of how the applicant plans to repair or has repaired the damage, including repair dimensions and hazard mitigation description and dimensions. The applicant should provide the following for each site: whether the work is complete, who performed or will perform the work, the proposed or completed repair scope of work, including PA mitigation measures, and technical studies, reports, and assessments. FEMA establishes a minimum project threshold for each federal fiscal year. If a project application totals less than the minimum threshold after the applicant has accounted for all project costs, including insurance proceeds and other reductions to avoid duplication of benefits, the project is ineligible. The minimum project threshold for fiscal year 2021 is $3,320. FEMA also establishes a dollar threshold each federal fiscal year for the implementation of simplified procedures under Section 422 of the Stafford Act. This threshold defines a project as large or small. The small project cap threshold for fiscal year 2021 is $132,800. As previously stated, small projects have a minimum requested amount of $3,320. Small projects are paid upon project worksheet obligation. For small projects, FEMA may accept certification in lieu of documentation and may process the projects based on estimated costs even if all work is completed. However, small project estimates are not subsequently adjusted to reflect actual cost. The applicant must still retain documentation for net small project overrun appeals and audits. A large project is one that exceeds $132,800 in estimated costs. With the exception of capped projects, the final eligible amount for a large project is the actual documented cost incurred to complete the eligible scope of work. The applicant must provide documentation to support the actual cost within 90 days of work completion. Final reimbursement is made following project completion, site inspection, file reviews, and project closeout by FEMA. The applicant must submit the following for each incomplete project on a quarterly basis: total expenditures to date, status of the project, whether the project is complete, projected or actual work completion date, and any circumstances that could delay the project. Quarters end on the last day of March, June, September, and December. Quarterly reports are due to be submitted to SEMA by the last day of April, July, October, and January. Applicants are required to follow the scope of work of a project to maintain eligibility. The applicant may identify a need to change the scope of work. In that event, the applicant would contact the state in order to submit a change in scope of work request that must be forwarded to FEMA for approval. A change request is a written request with detailed justification and documentation to support the eligibility of the requested revision. If the request involves previously unreported damage, the applicant must also provide documentation demonstrating how the incident caused the damage. Changes in the scope of work due to one of the following reasons are generally eligible. Alternate repair method is more cost-effective than the original proposed repair method. Original repair method is not technically feasible. Increase in previously approved quantities due to errors and omissions. Hidden damage discovered during construction and is disaster-related, or the applicant wishes to pursue an improved or alternate project. As a reminder, completion deadlines are as follows. The deadline for emergency work is 6 months from the declaration date. The deadline for permanent work is 18 months from the declaration date. If the applicant determines that it needs additional time to complete the work, the applicant must submit a written request for a time extension to the recipient with the following information: documentation substantiating delays beyond the applicant's control, a detailed justification for the delay, the current status of the work, and the project timeline with the projected completion date. SEMA has the authority to extend deadlines for individual projects based on extenuating circumstances. Except for temporary relocation projects, SEMA may extend emergency work up to an additional 6 months and permanent work up to an additional 30 months. Although FEMA only provides PA funding for work performed on or before the approved deadline, the applicant must still complete the approved scope of work for funding to be eligible. FEMA deobligates funding for any project that the applicant does not complete. If the applicant completes a portion of the approved scope of work and the completed work is distinct from the uncompleted work, FEMA only deobligates funding for the uncompleted work. Recipients and applicants are subject to federal and non-federal audits. Records are subject to audit by state or territorial government auditors, FEMA, the United States Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General, and the U.S. Government Accountability Office. FEMA may adjust project funding due to audit findings. A recipient or applicant that expends $750,000 or more in federal funding during its fiscal year must perform a single or program-specific audit. SEMA reserves the right to conduct periodic reviews of any applicant records to identify non-compliant applicants. Approval of procurement procedures, cost documentation, source documents, etc. by FEMA representatives does not provide assurance that auditors will not require the return of disaster grant funds should the Office of Inspector General disagree with those procedures. Financial records, supporting documents, statistical records, and all other non-federal entity records pertinent to a federal award must be retained for a period of 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report. SEMA provides a final expenditure report to applicants during the closure of their applicant disaster file. Here are some recommendations from SEMA. Maintain effective communications throughout the process between the applicant, SEMA, and FEMA. Contact your SEMA Public Assistance team with any and all questions. When in doubt, ask before performing work. Submit requests to make changes to projects prior to beginning work to maintain eligibility. Request time extensions prior to the expiration of period of performance deadlines. Use proper procurement standards. Follow contracting rules. Maintain appropriate oversight of contractors. Follow your established annual operating revenue internal controls when accounting for and expending disaster grant funds. It is not recommended to deposit grant funds in an interest-bearing account prior to the completion of work. Any or all interest earned must be remitted to SEMA. Contact SEMA to request interim payments and when projects are complete. Maintain eligibility by complying with the written scope of work for all obligated projects. Identify permitting, EHP, and codes and standards opportunities. Begin documentation immediately. Record volunteers for donated resources projects. Take photos of damages incurred. Identify all damages as soon as possible. Maintain detailed records identifying the source and application of funds for financially assisted activities. Organize timesheets, equipment logs, and materials by facility or site. Establish a project file, or site files, containing the approved corresponding project worksheet and all documentation pertaining to the project. Review invoices prior to payment and submission to SEMA. Costs incurred and paid do not necessarily equal reimbursable expenses. Document completed work with photographs for closeout. Please remember to submit your RPA as soon as possible. Contact your SEMA Public Assistance representatives with any questions related to the Public Assistance Program. This concludes the DR-4612 applicant briefing.